Hello, welcome. My name is Monique Ellefson, and I serve as the Program Manager for Student Success with Iowa and Minnesota Campus Compact. And I'm also a member of the Campus Compact Member Impact Committee. I'm so happy to have everyone join us today, and I really hope that you and your families are doing well during this time. Before we start today, there's a couple of things I'd like to do, the first of which is a land acknowledgement. So as a step toward honoring the truth and achieving healing and reconciliation, Campus Compact seeks to acknowledge the traditional native lands on which we stand. Given that we are gathering for today's webinar from across the country and some from around the world, we invite you to acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of the Native people where you are joining us from now in the chat. I am joining today from Des Moines, Iowa, which is the ancestral land of the Iowa, the Sauk, and Muscogee, and the Great Sioux Nation, also known as the Seven Fires Council people. But yes, please feel free to share that information in the chat so everyone can see. We also want to recognize and stand in solidarity with those individuals who are continuing to call for racial justice and equitable communities and affirm that Black Lives Matter. We commit to move beyond words and into programs and actions that fully embody a commitment to full participation and equity. So again, I'm so happy to have you as a part of today's webinar, which is titled Co-Producing Knowledge in Environmental Justice Research and Teaching with our presenters, who I will introduce shortly. I do have a couple of announcements from Campus Compact before we get started. So we are hosting our second round of the Fusion course. This is a training that provides support for faculty as they adapt to online teaching with community engagement components. This fall, we're hosting 3 sections of the Fusion course. They're each 2 weeks long, and they run from October through December, so we're kind of at the end, but that is happening. You can always find out more information and register for on the website, compact.org. I'd also like to highlight the Campus Compact podcast, which is called the Campus Nation podcast. In the latest episode, Compact President Andrew Seligson reflects on the outcome of the election and discusses the future of civic engagement among young people with Peter Levine, who is the Associate Dean of Academic Affairs and Lincoln Feline Professor of Citizenship and Public Affairs at Tufts University. You can listen and find the Compact Nation pod on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, SoundCloud, or wherever you get your podcasts. So let me now begin by introducing our speakers for today. I will formally just be introducing Esther, and then Esther will go on and introduce the other presenters for y'all. Esther Conrad serves as the Director of Community Engaged Learning for Environmental Sustainability at Stanford's Haas Center for Public Service. In this role, Esther fosters collaboration between faculty, students, and community organizations, and supports academic courses in which students partner with community organizations to address sustainability challenges. Esther is joined by Violet, Derek, and Dayland, whom she will introduce in just a moment. So I welcome our presenters today, and I will turn it over to you, Esther. You're muted, Esther, sorry.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Monique, for that introduction and for the opportunity to offer this webinar. I am going to share my screen and then begin with a short introduction. Okay. Wonderful. All right, in a minute, you should see the screen. All right, so we are very much looking forward to sharing some of our experience with community engaged learning around environmental justice issues, and in particular on how the co-production of knowledge across academic and community settings actually works in practice. This presentation will be anchored around a collaboration aimed at supporting climate resilience in East Palo Alto, California, as well as other nearby communities of color who bear some of the greatest burdens of climate risks. This effort has involved a number of partners who are listed here on this slide. Those include the nonprofit Climate Resilient Communities, from whom you'll be hearing today, a team of community leaders involved in the climate change community team, 2 community engaged courses at Stanford, as well as the Haas Center for Public Service. So as we talk through this experience, we'll be sharing insights on some of the following questions listed here. Why is co-production of knowledge so important in the context of environmental justice? What are key challenges arising when academic and community partners work together to co-produce knowledge? And what are some strategies that can help promote success, including during a remote setting during the COVID-19 pandemic? So the process of knowledge co-production, as I'm sure many of you know, is a lengthy one, as it takes time to build trust and a shared understanding of problems and potential solutions. So this webinar will unfold in 2 parts. And so you'll be hearing from our speakers twice, and we'll pause for a short Q&A opportunity in between. In part 1, Violet Sena from Climate Resilient Communities will be sharing a bit about East Palo Alto, climate risks in the community, and the community engagement process that she's been deeply involved with. Then Derek Ouyang and Delan Chan will be sharing how their students in their community engaged courses have worked in partnership with community leaders to design and implement a climate change survey to better understand community perspectives and priorities. Then we'll pause briefly for questions. So please, if you have questions on part 1, please go ahead and post them during the talk in the chat or the Q&A, and I'll be monitoring, and we'll pause to address some of those. In part 2, each of our speakers will touch upon how community needs, as well as the partnership, have evolved in 2020, especially in the context of the pandemic. They will be sharing highlights of how they have adapted community engagement and teaching and research in the context of COVID-19, and also the compound, this pandemic was actually compounded in this past summer with climate impacts, including heat waves and wildfire smoke. So we should have some time for Q&A at the very end as well. So again, please post your questions in the Q&A or the chat, and we will be monitoring them. Finally, I'd like to just take a minute to introduce our wonderful panelists with whom I've had an opportunity to collaborate over the past few years. Violet Sena is the Director of Climate Resilient Communities, an organization focused on giving local residents a voice in proactive resilience planning and adaptation. She works in partnership with the government sector, research institutions, community-based organizations, and communities to build community capacity to respond to climate change and sea level rise. Derek Ouyang is a lecturer in the Department of Geophysics at Stanford. He teaches in the Future Bay Initiative at Stanford and brings together graduate students with local government and community stakeholders to tackle complex urban systems challenges. And Delan Chan is a lecturer in the program on urban studies at Stanford. She specializes in project-based courses that are open to students from all disciplines and focus on sustainable cities and human-centered design. So now I'll hand it off to Violet, who will begin by introducing us to the community of East Palo Alto and the work of climate resilient communities.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Esther, for that introduction. Again, my name is Violet Sena, and I'm here today to share with you mostly the collaboration and the outcome of partnerships that we have built over the years between community-based organizations and also a research institute organization like Stanford University. So I am from Climate Resilient Communities. I am the director and founder. Climate Resilient Communities was a program under another organization for the past 4 years under ECTERA, and ECTERA is a nonprofit organization in Palo Alto with the whole goal of bringing people together to create local solutions for a healthy planet. Most of our work that I'll be covering today are some of the work that climate resilient communities engaged in while we were still under the ECTERRA umbrella. In September of this year, we transitioned out to build our own organization with the whole focus of working directly with communities to elevate leadership and strengthen their capacity to respond to climate change and sea level rise. Next slide, please. So climate resilient communities. We have several key programs. Can you go back another slide, please?
Sorry about that.
Yeah, thank you. So most of our programming is building community capacity, as well as increasing awareness and education around climate change, sea level rise, and other priority issues that are important to the community. So the bulk of our work is mainly building programming that are bottom up. We use a lot of community-based leadership and also addressing the needs and priorities of the community. So we have programs like Resilient Homes, where we work directly with low-income families to access free solar systems through our partners. We also help families to reduce energy bills, energy efficiency. We also host revitalization events where we bring together the community and all the other community organizations that offer services. So a lot of our work under CRC is directly community-based, and most of our programming are developed with the knowledge and also the priorities that we see that the community needs, and to try and fill in a lot of the gaps created by disparities, as well as a lot of the equity issues. So we work mostly with people of color, community that are frontlines to sea level rise, and we tried and support the city's efforts in building resiliency. Next slide, please, Derek. So East Palo Alto in California, for those who don't know where it is, it's actually located on the San Francisco Peninsula. It is roughly halfway between the city of San Francisco and San Jose. And it is surrounded by, by cities like Palo Alto and Menlo Park, very close to Atherton, which are, a lot of these cities are, well off compared to East Palo Alto. For example, the average income in East Palo Alto is around $64,000, and compared to Palo Alto and Menlo Park, you see average income of $157,000 or $147,000. Population is almost 30,000. I think the last census, the last data shows it 2028, but we're up to 29,000 people. 30% are low income. The majority of the population are Latinos, with roughly now about 65%. There is a high also Black community, African Americans. We also, a very high percentage of Pacific Islanders living in East Palo Alto. And some of the data I've seen, apart from Hawaii, East Palo Alto is the second city where a lot of Polynesians or a lot of Pacific Islands reside, and mostly Tongans and Samoans. Next slide, please. So it's a very, very diverse community in the South Bay or in the Bay Area, because not only the diversity in the population, but also, the social issues, and, it is one of those cities that are labeled as disadvantaged or unresourced. And apart from all the economic and social inequities, East Palo Alto is also one of the most vulnerable communities to climate change in San Mateo County. And as you can see, 49% of the city is under FEMA flood zones. It's highly vulnerable to sea level rise, also highly vulnerable to flooding. And not only the physical impact of the climate extremes, we always looked at the social impact to the families and the livelihoods of the community. And that's one of the aspects that, climate resilient communities focus on, not only the physical impact of these climate change to the communities, but as well as, how adaptive or how the community will be able to respond to the climate extremes. Next slide, please. So there's another climate change impact. This is a study we did last year, and climate, we found that the number of heat days in East Palo Alto will increase. Already they are impacted by the fires. Also, they are highly vulnerable to heat-related illness because a lot of the elderly population, there's a high percentage of elderly population living in East Palo Alto. The other vulnerabilities as well is when we look at the existing infrastructures and the existing services. Again, this is a community that is under-resourced and need a lot of assistance in building, building programs and structures that can help the city to adapt to these projected climate extremes. So it is a highly vulnerable community to sea level rise, to flooding, to heat related illnesses or heat stress. And on top of that, the availability of resources really puts them on that high vulnerable side of the issue. Next slide, please. So because of the vulnerability of East Palo Alto, as well as the existing capacity, since CRC has been working in this community, we've heard many times that, the community needs to be at the table to help the city, not only help the city, but also have their voices heard on the issues that the city needs to address or the county needs to address to help them increase their adaptive capacity to respond to climate change. And because the city of East Palo Alto doesn't have, they don't have a sustainability office, the environmental office with the city focused mostly on the services, the environmental services. So there was a need to create some capacity to bring not only community leaders together, but also other community-based organizations, even the city, to join forces to lead efforts, in responding to climate change. So in 2019, climate resilient communities under Actera received funding from the county. And what we have proposed for that funding was to build a climate change community team. So we worked, we spearheaded this effort, and we brought a team together, creating infrastructures or even creating leadership to start looking at not only allowing the voices of the community to be heard in the planning process around climate change, but also it became a force of leadership. They are currently leading some of these work by providing guidance and also directing some of the climate change efforts in East Palo Alto. So as you can see on the screen, the diversity of this team, it's not only community leaders, you have people representing different sectors, from the health, from education. And we also have, I'm proud to say, we even have representatives from the youth, from the church. And they have all been together since 2019 to help with the efforts in the community. Next slide, please, Derek. So this is one of the meetings, like we usually have evening meetings, and not only we meet monthly to to discuss climate change projects and programming, but when there is a project that we work on, we usually meet more than once in a month. So this is one of those meetings that we held in 2019. I think this was to plan for the climate change survey. So since, you can move to the next slide, Derek. So since, so the climate change community team was formed in March 2019. And during our first meeting, the whole team agreed that because they wanted to lead, with tools, they were going to make decisions not only for themselves, but also for the city. They wanted to have a ground foundation, like they wanted to have the right tools, the right data to make decisions. And one of the key concerns at the time was none of them really understood the level of awareness of the whole community in East Palo Alto around climate change. So we needed to, they asked if we could carry out a climate change community survey. One is to make sure that we have the data to base, planning purposes, but also the data will also help them prioritize their actions, prioritize their time on what would be immediate needs that the climate change community will need to work on. So there are a lot of reasons, but the main reason was to understand the level of awareness of climate change in East Palo Alto, and also try to figure out what are some priorities that we need to tackle, with the work that they were spearheaded with. So, and this came out during the first climate change community team. And because, with our project at the time, we didn't have funding to implement a survey. Survey was not even on the project document. So immediately, Acterra and climate resilient communities agreed because it was a priority from the team. So immediately we had to find resources to make this happen. And because of at the time, we have a very good relationship with Stanford and Derek, who will be speaking next through other programs in East Palo Alto. I immediately reached out to Derek if him and his team could help the climate change community team to carry out this climate change survey. So from our side, climate resilient communities, we were able to engage with Stanford, with Derek and his team in the beginning to plan the climate change survey, and then later on with DeLand and her team to analyze the data. But we also we were successful in securing funding from the other partners like Peninsula Clean Energy and Stanford PACS with the funding to implement the project. So before I give it to Derek, I just want to say that, it was a successful project. And since then, the climate change community team have presented the findings of the survey to several outlets since we completed the survey last year. Thank you.
Great.
Thank you, Violet. I'll turn it over to you, Derek.
Thanks so much. So as a reminder, my name is Derek. I'm one of the two instructors that have been engaged in community-based work that we'll be speaking today. The Future Bay Initiative, which I'm a part of, has a little bit more of an engineering and earth science background in terms of disciplines. So in our journey of building out the Future Bay Initiative, it's been related to the themes of this webinar, which is broadening our notions of what knowledge production can look like and how that can engage multiple partners and kind of break out of the silos of traditional academia. To pick up the story where Violet left it off, so we've done a lot of different sea level rise based modeling at a regional scale, traffic modeling. You can see some of that stuff on our website at bay.stanford.edu. But this particular story started with a phone call from Violet saying, hey, we have this urgent need from the community team to develop a survey. And that was genuinely an area we hadn't really done much prior work in. But what that looked like, as you can see in some of the snapshots on this slide, were students over spring and summer quarter of 2019 involved in designing a survey. And the content of that survey was a very iterative process in which we were meeting regularly with the community team that Violet mentioned to make sure that the questions were rigorous and designed to be understood by the respondents, but also aligning with the goals and intents of the team. It looked like, as you can see on the top right, sampling design, which involved some technical skills around just, how do you select blocks in East Palo Alto that are representative of overall census demographics, and that requires being able to work with statistical information and information from the Census Bureau. And the choice to specifically select blocks, because that was useful from a practical implementation perspective, where we knew we were going to have volunteers, many of whom were essentially high school students from a local youth group in East Palo Alto that would conduct the actual door-to-door surveying, and it would be useful to have just blocks that they could receive on a map, like you could see on the bottom right. They can receive a list of addresses and basically walk in a clockwise direction and document and log what their experience was, in addition to using an iPad-based or phone-based survey tool that could record digital responses and offline. All that work took myself and a few students in the Future Bay Initiative across spring and summer to put together. So let me just give kind of 3 high-level structural points here and then hand it off to Deland. One is that it was so important here to work in concert with the East Palo Alto climate change community team to develop the knowledge acquisition tool here, which in effect is saying that we needed a co-production approach to deciding what kind of knowledge we valued and to understand the process by which we were going to put that together. And that really just required that flexibility, an iterative approach of having multiple drafts of the survey instrument and all the various techniques and the training process and so forth, and really get buy-in from many different players. And that's a process that really needs to be prepared and something that everybody commits to from the start in a process like this. A related point too is that the typical layer of research structure that academics may want to put to this was just off the table from the get-go. Because if we started the conversation saying we need to get IRB approval because we want to publish this in a journal, we wouldn't have helped at all, right? That would have turned off many players in this ecosystem that wanted community-based knowledge for immediate prioritization of the efforts of a community team. And so I think it took some tact from us to recognize that the traditional approach would have been to think about publications, because that's the way university goes about its work. But we recognize the urgency and the need for flexibility here, that we did not put those constraints on the way we wanted to participate and really tried to co-produce this with our partners. The last point here is that we needed more time than the traditional semester or quarter. And I think many community-based efforts fail simply because they have a kind of clear end date when the students finish their course. So we already have designed our work in the Future Bay Initiative to be able to go from quarter to quarter. So we had students in spring, and then we also found ways for them to basically become embedded interns or fellows through the support of the Haas Center in Actera during the summer. And so that was really critical to do the kind of work that ended up being 300 door-to-door responses. But as a segue to Deland, we also needed more time because that process actually did take longer than we expected. And by August, we thought we were going to have not only the surveys done, but the data all processed. But we had only just gotten the door-to-door surveying started. So we knew we needed to hand it off to another organization at Stanford to do the data analysis, which is where I guess I also picked up the phone and called Deland and said, hey, this is a kind of linear process, and we'd love to link up with your resources and your team over at Urban Studies. So I'll hand it off now to Deland to continue the conversation.
Great, thanks so much, Derek. This is a great way to transition the story to how my Sustainable Cities class in the fall was involved. So hello, everyone. My name is Deland Chan. It's great to be with you. For my segment, I'd like to start by giving a brief background about the Sustainable Cities class that I teach, and then discuss the specific project partnership with the climate resilient communities. So Sustainable Cities is a class where students collaborate with San Francisco Bay Area government agencies and nonprofit organizations to support their sustainability goals. The program on urban studies is an undergraduate major, so the class is intended for primarily undergraduate students, especially urban studies majors who are looking to fulfill their community engaged learning requirements. But the class is open to students from all disciplines and years, as there are no prerequisites. So in the past, I've had students who range from first year to graduate students majoring in urban studies, to public policy, to computer science, mechanical engineering, civil engineering, and even English and law. So the course assumes no prior background in urban studies. It really aims to start by nurturing a T-shaped student, where the first half of the course is really going wide and broad in establishing a foundation, and then going deep and narrow in connecting specific topics. I find that the structure really enables students to gain the broad knowledge that they need to know about sustainability policies and frameworks, but at the same time be able to develop the skills and subject expertise for tackling their specific projects. So each year, the class size has been around 25 students, each working with 5 different community partners, or roughly about 5 different students per team. There are a few important aspects about this class. The first is that we really aim to look at sustainability holistically. So unlike courses where students could spend an entire semester or quarter focusing on one aspect of sustainability, such as housing, Sustainable Cities really tries to provide students with an overview of various sustainability topics and frameworks, and then try to explain how they fit together, and also provide tangible examples of how these issues overlap and unfold in a real world project. So for example, this class discusses how issues of sustainable transportation are related to affordable housing, healthy food access, economic development, really trying to allow students to connect the dots and to see how these sustainability issues are interrelated. In this course, we use the 4 pillars of sustainability framework, where we're really assessing communities through the following lenses, through environmental quality, economic vitality, social equity, and cultural continuity. And really through this framework, it's to provide a scaffold for students to ask critical questions beyond what is sustainability, and then ask instead, is it sustainable for whom and how? Next slide, please. So in fall 2019, one of the 5 project teams partnered with climate resilient communities. The team from Sustainable Cities was responsible for surveying additional households for the climate change community survey, but really they focus on analyzing the results to glean insights by disaggregating the demographics, and then ultimately creating resources that can support advocacy and capacity building for the community. So very specifically, their tasks were to input and compile the survey results, to identify the various gaps, analyze the findings. They produced a research report to summarize findings and policy recommendations. And they also developed kind of a 1-pager infographic or visual summarizing the survey results. And then ultimately they created and delivered a final presentation to the climate change community team and members of the general public. So a lot of this work, as you see in these photos, involves students engaging in additional surveying out in the field at community events, attending the climate change community meetings in East Palo Alto, where they could present their work for feedback and review. Next slide, please. So we can share the link later. If we can go back. Yes, thank you. So we can share the link later in terms of the final deliverables, which is the written report and infographic. Both have been shared with policymakers and community advocates. But just to reflect on some of the challenges that we faced, I think the team did have to adjust to a changing scope of work. They had initially chosen a project with the assumption that certain pieces would be in place before they started. But I think because of the realities of a real world project, the course needed to be flexible and to adjust accordingly. It could be tough when students select a project based on their skills and what they can expect to learn, but they still ended up working on a project that involved a slightly tangential but really still related set of tasks. And I think what really matters was that their efforts actually led to real impact at the end of the day.
Terrific. Thank you all so much for those really very insightful and also very succinct presentations. I appreciate that we've had to move things along in terms of the timing. I think we'll just shift directly into part 2, as I haven't seen any questions and we are a little short on time, and hopefully we'll have time for a few questions at the end if anybody would like to post them in the chat. I know, Derek, you have to leave right at 1. However, I'd like to right now invite Violet to begin the next section, and I'll also in the interim be posting in the chat links to each organization's, each of the speakers' websites at this time. Violet.
Yes. Next slide, please. Yes. Okay. So this is trying to transition into a different more like same conversation, but since COVID-19, a lot of the work around climate change has been stalled a little bit from our end, and mainly because climate resilient communities is all about the community, and what we value are the priorities from the community. And since COVID-19, again, East Palo Alto was hit hard due to not only because the majority, a lot of the residents, they work in essential services, jobs. Many families in East Palo Alto shared homes. So you find homes where you find multi-generation, families. Like I've worked with families in East Palo Alto where there are around like 18 people living in one house. Even the average, I think it's around 15 people to 18. So a lot of those, those status, because of the diversity of the community and also the social, the social issues faced by East Palo Alto makes them as well more vulnerable to the spread of COVID-19. And on top of that, the trust, because it is, I find in the past couple of months in conversations with community leaders, there are people in East Palo Alto who believe that the COVID is not real. So we do have a lot of work. And so a lot of our climate change work have not only it's not like we haven't moved forward with the continual work, even though a lot has to be done, because climate resilient communities, usually we meet with the community. We do a lot of person-to-person meetings and conversations, but since then, a lot of that work has been done online. But then again, the same issues have come up similar to climate change. What we have found from the climate change survey, next slide please, is that in communities like East Palo Alto, there is a lot of, there are a lot of gaps that we need to fill, whatever issues you're working on. So again, this is one of the, one of the results that we receive from the survey is that, community awareness, education around these issues are very important to adapting to climate change. And we find the same issues again with COVID-19. Even today, last week, conversations with the teams on the ground trying to increase testing sites or people to come there. We actually in East Palo Alto, there are quite a lot of opportunities to get tested, but we don't see the community going out to get tested because they don't have the right information or the understanding to do, to take action. So whatever issues that, communities like East Palo Alto faces, there we have to deal with, the underlying, underlying roots of the problems. And again, Derek will talk more about how they also had to transition to community priorities, because it is all about the communities with the work that we do. Thank you.
Violet. There's a lot to say as well about how just academia and education has changed in the time of COVID. I think Deland will speak more to that. So let me just tell a kind of parallel story to my 3 points from the first half, which is, how did the Future Bay Initiative particularly respond in 2020, and how did it parallel what we did in 2019? We found that a lot of the gaps in both scholarship and in the policy discourse around COVID were in genuinely areas in which there was a lack of knowledge on all parts, which is especially this topic of compounding crises. And that's true already in climate situations as we think about heat waves and floods and so forth, potentially compounding impacts. But here we had a unique case of a pandemic environment. And then on top of that, you could still have those climate challenges that these communities were facing. We did see that, as Esther mentioned earlier, with wildfires and heat waves. So as we continued the conversation with Violet and others, we felt like one thing we could do is do a really rigorous interview-based approach to get as many conversations had as we could in a virtual format to understand how vulnerable populations, which we defined as older folks, parents with children, or owners of small businesses, how they were faring in the late spring and into summer. And we actually, in that process, were able to also get them to reflect on wildfires as they began to happen in 2020. You can see here the description of actually 2 studies. So the one I just described is on the left. It was 40 long-form interviews that have been coded up and are being prepared as a series of presentations and reports back to the community. And this is yet again a way we linked up with DeLand to build out more of that reporting and insight back to the community. But it is also on the publication track. And on the right side, there's an even longer term project we've recently gotten funding for to actually take coastal flooding regions, which would include East Palo Alto, sample about 150 households, and actually just follow them for the whole 2 years and have multiple surveys through that process. With the bittersweet understanding that there are likely to be climate events like flooding during those 2 years. And we're particularly interested to see what are we not understanding about just how fragile housing situations can be for these households. And if we can discover that, then we can build better awareness, better advocacy, better fundraising, better policy work to support these communities. Now, my meta points on this. First, once again, this is a co-production of knowledge, which deeply involves a knowledge acquisition method that is typically undervalued in academia because of the length and resources that are implied in doing this work, right? These were very long, hour plus interviews. We needed to find a way to reach exactly the kinds of underrepresented groups in most research on these topics. And then, we're just starting to get to the complexities of the 2-year study. But I think this was us exploring and discovering just how important this ecosystem in which we're deeply engaged with community partners are. For example, the way we were able to reach 40 residents was by really word of mouth, because we couldn't engage with them in physical terms. We needed ways for them to agree to join on Zoom calls for these long discussions and build the willingness to. Other researchers in the audience might recognize this as basically a snowball sampling approach, but it really wouldn't have been effective without a deep, already built-in relationships with many of the organizations that helped us identify individuals. Point 2 here, remember I talked about how research rigor was kind of off the table for the much quicker turnaround on the climate survey in 2019. But given the kind of lull and how there was just this delay with COVID, in these 2 cases, we are able to bring that research rigor in and get these set up not just for immediate insight back to the community, but to be able to leverage all the benefits of academia and getting insight in journals to then add more clout to the points we're making, which might be important for persuading important decision makers at other scales of affecting the Bay Area. And I think that just goes, again, to show the importance of investing in long-term relationships so that when the time is right, there can be the development of academic scholarship alongside direct impact to communities, and to find the synergistic value in that. And then the last point here is that you might recognize a very similar structure has taken place again, where we can sort of immediately pivot and be flexible quarter by quarter and have a continuous connection as well. So in spring, we pivoted to remote work entirely, and we were looking for COVID engagements, of which we've had many, but in this case, it included developing the project on the left side, which then required a continuity into summer fellowships and interns to continue doing the interviews in summer. And yet again, we needed help in fall, come fall, to get even more coding of the interviews and insight. So we connected once again with DeLand's great course. So I'll leave it there and hand it off to DeLand.
Sounds good. Thanks, Derek. So I just wanted to end by sharing some reflections on teaching a community-engaged learning course during the time of COVID. And this might be an experience that many of you are familiar with at this point. But when teaching sustainable cities in fall 2020, the course was completely remote. The project all ended up having some focus on COVID-19, although this was not intentional, but really because of what the community partners' priorities were immediately focused on. So the topics dealt with issues of housing eviction, food insecurity, small businesses, air quality monitoring, particularly during the California wildfires, and the COVID-19 and climate resiliency interview project that Derek mentioned. Teaching during COVID definitely had its share of surprises. I learned that the community engaged learning structure is actually really well suited for student engagement. I think students are really drawn to the class because of the projects, focused on real world pandemic impacts, which is really relevant to their current lives and realities. And the students, did a lot of their learning in small project teams, which is really motivating for them to have kind of that place for them to really get to know their kind of small teams. But there were also a few challenges. First, I had some first-year students where this was their first quarter at Stanford. They've never been to the Bay Area, and due to lack of physical and field context, this can make it difficult when the class is really focused on understanding sustainability issues in the specific geographic context. It's also challenging for me as an instructor to maintain human connection with the students. We had to make extra effort to check in with students and the partners using multiple communication channels. So next slide, please. So in fall 2020, a team of 6 Sustainable City students supported the Climate Ready North Fair Oaks project. Their work involved transcribing the interviews conducted previously in summer 2020, creating a code book in NVivo, which is a qualitative software, distilling the analysis to kind of various key insights, which they then shared as part of a focus group with Climate Ready North Fair Oaks community partners, and then ultimately creating a final report and infographic to summarize what they learned. I think throughout this process, the key idea was that the research process had to be iterative, that there would be some time for the analysis to occur, and then you would involve the community partners in the process of reflecting on analysis of the results to date, and then to still have the opportunity to tweak the research process based on feedback. I think that really speaks to the co-production of knowledge that we're trying to do here. Next slide, please. So just in terms of lessons for remote teaching and what we could adapt in the post-pandemic world, in some cases, remote meetings actually made it easier for students to have frequent contact with their community partners versus previously, the students would travel to the partner sites and we would actually provide a transportation budget for them to do so. At this point, the students had almost weekly, sometimes even more frequent meetings with the community partners. And I think that's definitely something we could integrate in the future. One of the student teams was able to present remotely to the City of Milpitas Economic Development and Trade Commission, which they really enjoyed. Another team had meetings with tenant leaders who live in single room occupancy hotels and are involved in the Central City SRO Collaborative in San Francisco. And I think all of this is really quite positive. It's always useful when students have constant feedback and contact with their partners, and despite being offsite, the remote format still helped to facilitate those more frequent conversations. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Thank you all again for that. Part 2, I feel like it really spoke to, I think, where a lot of us are at in terms of trying to grapple with the reality of community engaged learning in the COVID times, but and hopeful story about how that can still generate positive co-produced knowledge and sustained relationships. We have just a few minutes, so if anyone, I haven't seen questions come in, but please do. I have one coming in right now. More discussion about, so the question is regarding, could you discuss more about how your university supports this work? And so I'll pose that to Derek and DeLand if you have specific things to share. And then also Violet, if you want to chime in about what kinds of support is particularly useful for you in being able to partner on this kind of work.
I can start. So I think from my perspective as instructor, I really am grateful to the Haas Center for a lot of the funding that they provide for the course. And some of the funding we use for student project budget, so allowing students to travel to the site. We also provide a small honorarium to the community partner just to recognize their labor and their time in supporting the course, and in some ways to play a role as co-instructor. This fall, I actually benefited from a community engaged learning coordinator as well, which is a student who can help essentially act as a teaching assistant for the course. And that was extremely helpful just in terms of maintaining all of the different moving pieces of teaching in a remote format.
Great, Derek, if you have, I know you have to leave, so if you have any quick
Yeah,
comment
I'll
to
pass it
add.
back to you. I think the Haas Center resources would be good to talk about here.
Okay. Yeah, just very briefly, the Haas Center for Public Service provides grants to community engaged courses like Delan's and Derek's to support all of the additional costs that community engagement offers, and also support in identifying partnerships sometimes, depending on the course. That's also sometimes also something we offer. Violet, let me just, if you have any quick thought to share on the support that has been valuable for you, and then we'll try to
Yes.
fit in one more question. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. I think from our end, like, community organizations, nonprofits, usually we don't have enough funding or capacity to hire staff to work on these immediate priorities from the community. And so in the past years, I've been depended a lot the support from Stanford. Not only they are providing the technical support to enable us to complete the projects or to run or implement programming. It also means, our community organization doesn't have to fork out the funding to pay for these interns. Most of the time they are funded by the university or the Haas Center. So for that, we are for that support from the university.
Okay. Well, I want to thank you for those. I want to pivot to at least one more question, and we might just stay on a couple minutes after one, because we did start a few minutes late. But a question has come in about, how do you balance co-creation and valuing community concerns with gaps in risk assessment, i.e. flood risks and COVID severity? And what I believe is being asked here, and I apologize if I'm getting this wrong, is that there's some community concerns and interests in understanding certain issues, and then there might be, from an academic perspective, some gaps in what we understand about what the degree of flood risk is, which may not always align with what the community is most concerned about. So how do you balance those issues?
Maybe this can be my last comment here, and then I'll have to hop off. I personally think this is quite a nuanced point, and is probably the most important kind of judgment call that a group of community and academic partners need to constantly be having in their discourse. I certainly wouldn't say that the answer to this is to fully align and let all work be completely driven by what comes through in town hall meetings, if that's a kind of example of what a community priority could look like, because we know what could potentially happen with just who gets represented in certain settings and community engagements, and how those priorities can play out in housing and climate and other issues. We certainly take it upon ourselves in the Future Bay Initiative to attempt wherever we can to present scientific insights if we think they are of importance to community partners. And so far in our experience with climate, there never has really been a disconnect there. There's been a desire from organizations, community members in East Palo Alto to build better understanding of what those risks are. And then once we've provided the insights we have developed through scientific work, that really has driven conversations. But I think it's fair to say that there can be disconnects there. There can also be the disconnect between the general community in a neighborhood like East Palo Alto and the representatives from community-based organizations. And that may just be, a level of the investment of time that needs to be put in by anybody to understand long-term challenges to urban systems is just outside of the capacity of anybody on a day-to-day basis if you're just trying to live your life. And I think there's an understanding of the importance of community leadership in communities like East Palo Alto as already. And then an extension of that is an understanding of the role of experts quote unquote experts from academic institutions nearby like Stanford. But it's such an important negotiation. And I would just say it's definitely not, we shouldn't be moving in a direction where it's an entire one directional relationship there. And that part of what producing good insights and good impact to community is a back and forth dialogue between academia, community partners, business partners, public servants, et cetera.
Great, thank you so much, Derek. Really appreciate the questions, and please, if there are ones, I think there are one or two we haven't gotten to, but we'd be happy to follow up if you just post your email in the chat to the panelists. I want to pass it back to Monique, and a big thanks to all of the panelists. Monique, I don't know if you had a couple of comments to wrap things up.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wasn't letting me unmute, of course. So thank you all so much for sharing your knowledge and expertise. I know Derek had to hop off, but I appreciate him as well. Your work really speaks, I think, broadly to how we can all be approaching these co-creative partnerships and really centering community knowledge in response to really important issues. So just a quick reminder to close things out for our attendees. You will receive an evaluation either shortly or tomorrow sometime, just asking about how your experience was today on this Campus Compact webinar. We thank you all so much for joining us. We really hope that you got something out of today, and your feedback is very valuable to us. So thank you, everyone, and this will be recorded and shared out too. So if you want to revisit or share out with your own community, please feel free to do that. Thank you all.